All right, now we're joined by John Persak, who's running for Port Commission, position 4. So go ahead with the 2-minute introduction.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I'm John Persak, running for the open seat on the Seattle Port Commission. I actually work at the port. I've been in the maritime industry for about 19 years, and so I have a very unique and nuanced and experiential understanding of how the port actually operates, both in terms of an operational standpoint and also from a government standpoint, because I engage the port on a whole host of issues. My priorities are supporting the port function in creating living wage jobs for all of King County and our region, maintaining support for livable communities around our seaport and our airport, and finally, last but certainly not least, making environmental stewardship a priority. And of course, that's been a huge topic of discussion with the port for the last couple of years especially. So definitely want to shorten it up a little bit because I do love taking questions. Just a little bit of my background. I grew up in Puget Sound, lived here all of my life. Family is from maritime and the aerospace industry as well as aviation. My mother and father both worked at Boeing, and my mother was a loadmaster for the Navy as well. So lots of maritime and manufacturing and aviation in my background. So it's very, very family oriented. Closing, I just want to name check, the fishing community. I know that there's a huge effort to recapitalize our fishing fleet in Ballard, and there's lots of efforts to make sure that that is built here in Seattle, particularly in the Ballard Inner Bay area. Of course, maintaining our working waterfront, which is what's given me so many opportunities to be politically involved. And also, our airport is a huge jobs creator, revenue generator, and making sure there's fairness at the airport, and also for workers and those communities that are impacted around there too. So there you have it. Port of Seattle.
Great, thank you very much. So now we have our 4 prepared questions. We're asking all candidates for report, and they're right in front of you if you want to turn them over and read along as we read them out loud. These are 2-minute answers, and Nicole, will you do the board?
Sure. It says, what is your plan to keep the Port of Seattle competitive when other ports offer similar services at lower costs?
Interesting. So I guess I'll take the first answer to this from the maritime side. So as you know, the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma have recently entered into an agreement to jointly manage the container and break bulk operations in the Port of Seattle and Tacoma. It's called the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and all 10 commissioners are the governing body of that. And one of the primary goals was to make sure that Seattle and Tacoma are not competing with one another, both in terms of job creation, attracting business to Puget Sound, and other issues such as lease rates. The lower lease rates go, the more of a burden there is on taxpayers. And finally, there's less incentive for ports to compete with one another in terms of lessening of environmental priorities. So having that joint venture, they can go out, they can market the Puget Sound, they call it the North Harbor and the South Harbor, internationally, bring in customers. There's a huge project going on at Terminal 5 where they want to bring in some business there. The master use permits have already been issued for that project. And so by combining operations and combining staff and not competing, they're actually saving quite a bit of money there just in terms of the operational aspect. And so that makes it less likely that they have to go back to the taxpayers and say, well, we need a levy increase because our operations are more expensive as more business comes in. So I think it's a great deal for this region. It's a great deal for our state, and there's going to be a lot of jobs coming with that. There's a 70% increase in cargo volumes in Terminal 18 over in Harbor Island. That will probably top out in about a month or so, beginning in March, and probably top out in July. So it's bringing business in, and it's a pretty good deal for working people and taxpayers both.
Great. Then number 2.
What is your position on the leasing of port facilities to oil drilling operations?
I think it's a bad idea. And I'll call out that I know that this is referring to the lease with Foss, who in turn leased to the Shell Oil Company to refurbish their oil platform that's going to Alaska. My understanding is there was a number of uses that could have been handled at Terminal 5 in the interim while they were talking about modernizing that and shopping for My position is that, yes, they're very good jobs. You know, yes, it was, you know, some revenue to the port, but the cost in terms of one, you know, violating our community standards in terms of like what we expect from an environmental standpoint. You know, we're trying to cut down on fossil fuels, we're trying to combat climate change, and just having that here without any input from the public was a bad move for so many reasons. I think in a lot of ways it hindered the reputation of the port to go out and sell the business to future customers, because it undermined the credibility that it had with the taxpayers of King County. And so when you go out and you're trying to bring in business and they see that there's a lot of disagreements with the public about what the port should do and what the function should be, people don't want to do business there. And so in the long term, I would have liked to have seen something else, like car ships. You know, there's a on-dock rail there. Car ships would have been an appropriate use. Any other type of break bulk. And then in terms of it being vacant, well, you know, maybe eating the cost for a little while of being vacant probably would have outweighed the cost, both from a social and political standpoint, as well as an ethical standpoint of just bringing that here in the first place. So for the future, absolutely not. There's plenty of other business we can attract here to the Northwest, and so I'll just leave it at that.
Item number 3.
So, what changes or reforms do you support for the Port Commission itself?
That is an excellent question. So I think one of the biggest challenges of the Port Commission is its governance structure. And what I mean by that is relationship with the CEO, its relationship with the staff, and its relationship with overseeing the operations of senior staff, and just the port as a whole. Every board, if you've ever sat on a board, and I imagine most of the people in this room probably have, there's a governance policy that sets the relationship between the board and the CEO. And the governance policy that I've found, it's a resolution 3605. It outlines, you know, what the divisions of duties are, but there isn't really much that addresses the outcomes, like what is expected in terms of outcomes, whether it's labor relations, whether it's environmental stewardship, whether it's what types of outcomes we want in terms of community empowerment or community involvement even. And so, and this policy was passed in 2009, and so I imagine that there's been tweaks to it since then, but I think there has to be a complete comprehensive review of the policy in terms of how the Port Commission deals with the CEO and deals with staff. And I think in the long term, that will address a lot of these problems that we've seen come up over time. Like, for example, the payouts to the top executives that didn't have proper review, and the state audit committee found that they were actually illegal. That's, you know, probably the most contemporary example. And so, having said that, I think ultimately having a port that is answerable to the public and is willing to engage with the public and deal with these issues on the front end is a lot more effective than, you know, hoping that things would pass and that maybe, you know, things can move on. I'm still pretty bothered by that particular decision myself and how it went down. So I'd like to see some reform in the governance structure.
And summary number 4.
Do you believe you have achieved full transparency in the port's contracting and compensation practices? Or do you believe we have achieved full transparency in the port's contracting and compensation practices, and where do you see possibilities for further improvement?
Trying to answer this from the standpoint of somebody who's not an incumbent, but from what I know, I don't think there's full transparency, obviously, and okay. Well, for one, let's talk about the airport. I haven't talked enough about the airport. There's a lot of contracting issues out at the airport. I know that there's large contracts there that benefits the union workforce. And it's my understanding that a lot of those are being broken up, and it creates, it undermines the bargaining power of unions. And when we undermine the bargaining power of unions, we don't create a situation where people can have their needs met, wages, working conditions, and so forth. So in terms of full transparency, I mean, I believe that there has to be, from the front end, there has to be public involvement, there has to be notification of the affected communities, whether they're in the community or they're actually workers there. There has to be an opportunity for people to weigh in. And when people weigh in, they ask questions, and when they ask questions, then rocks get overturned and there's more questions. And I think just a rigorous process to see like how contracts are signed, whether they're subcontracting, whether they're leases at the airport or the seaport. Those two things, just rigorous public process and getting more input would be definitely one way to improve that. Got a little bit more time. In terms of other possibilities for further improvement, well, I think there has to be more oversight by the commission. I know that some contracts are delegated to the CEO and the staff to just deal with it and sign, and I think maybe there needs to be a little bit more oversight. A little bit more needs to come before the commission as a finished project, as opposed to something that's in process and then just gets signed off down the road.
Great, so now we'll open up to follow-up questions. These are 1-minute answers, and we'll start with Liz.
So I'm wondering if you see it as a responsibility and an accountability within the Port Commission's purview specifically to deal with the fact that our port is one of the 2, I think, most porous ports in the country for sex trafficking and for human trafficking. I'm wondering if that's something you would, as a commissioner, see in the commission's purview, and what steps are you going to take to redress it?
That's definitely something the commission could take a look at from a policy perspective. And obviously they would have to, assign those duties and assign outcomes to staff, whether that's the security workers, whether that's the port's police department, perhaps a interdepartmental team to take a look into that issue. I think that's where it starts. And in terms of having all the answers of where that goes, like, I'm not a police officer, so I don't know what the ins and outs of the investigation are, but I think the Port Commission does play a role in setting the tone at the top that says, yes, this is a priority, we're going to direct staff to do certain things and to work with each other within the port to address that issue.
David, Bevan, and Ben?
When you were answering our question before, you said that you hadn't said enough about the airport. So I thought I'd give you the opportunity to take another minute
Okay.
and give us your perspectives on the airport in terms of infrastructure, congestion, so access, where the train stops, whatever you think the needs of the airport have to be separate from the small business contractors that we referred to
Sure.
in your answer to number 4.
Okay. Well, first of all, there's the communities that are underneath the flight paths that are complaining a lot about particulate matter, about noise, and asking reasonable things from the port about how to mitigate those effects. And to my understanding, the port has done some work in terms of asking the FAA to give them more time to do outreach to the community so these issues can be addressed, whether it's soundproofing of housing, whether it's noise monitoring, whether it's, air particulate monitoring from the Northwest Clean Air Agency, things like that. There's one issue. Number 2, and I know this is huge, particularly for the city of SeaTac, is that city of SeaTac has 28,000 people, but the peak daytime population is about 6-fold. And so that's a lot of impact on infrastructure, there's a lot of impact on city services, there's a lot of traffic. And so the city of SeaTac needs some help. They do receive some help. We would need to take a look and see if that's adequate help from the port to mitigate those effects. It looks like I've ran out of time. I could probably keep going, but it's a good time, so.
Great, Bevan, and then Ben.
So do you believe that the commission position should be full-time? And if you do, how would you fund that? If you don't, why not?
I'm not going to take the position that it should be full-time. My expectation going into it is what it is. I know that there's been some advocacy around that and having more staff. I think to be an effective commissioner, you have to be where the decisions are gonna impact you. Like, for example, a lot of commissioners are consultants, they own businesses here or on the other side of the mountains. I actually work at the port. So my real job, when I'm not a commissioner, will be to go down and take a job driving a piece of equipment down the marine terminal. And so, to that extent, that's where I'm gonna make the other half of my money, but I'm also gonna continue to be engaged with my coworkers. I'm gonna be engaged in the community like I have been already on freight mobility and land use and other such issues where worker issues and port issues coincide. And so, full-time position, you know, that's not my expectation. More staff, well, if there was an opportunity to move people around and have more staff that were the eyes and ears of the commissioners, I would definitely be open to that. But in terms of hiring additional staff, I don't see the budget justification for that, but I'd have to, you know, take a look at that.
All right, Ben, and then Blake.
What policies would you like to enact to make the port more environmentally friendly, and how would you enact them?
I sat on the port's energy and sustainability committee with some environmental and labor advocates, BJ Cumming from the Warms River Coalition and Leonard Smith from the Teamsters and some other folks. And what we did on that committee is we worked with about probably 20 other stakeholders on other component parts of that committee, and we drafted a policy on how the commission is going to set the goal of being carbon neutral or carbon negative by 2050. And the port actually passed a policy last March with all that down. It's actually up on our website. Now, of course, it's easy to pass a resolution, it's easy to pass policy. It's an entirely different thing to implement it. And so, as a port commissioner, I can take that policy that I'm familiar with how it got crafted, and I can actually make sure it's implemented by directing staff, following up with staff. And one of the core parts of it for me was that the solutions need to be community-centered and community-directed. You know, it's one thing for commissioners to just say, well, this sounds good, we're just gonna pass this and get the low-hanging fruit. But if it's not relevant to the community, then it's not gonna work as well. There's not gonna be the buy-in.
All right.
It's really gonna see it. So, sorry.
Yep, a little over, sorry. So Clayton, then I have one, then John.
Yep.
I'd like to address the airport a little bit in terms of its physical plan. How do you see the demands, the functional demands of the airport in this period of growth that we have, and requiring changes to the physical plant of the airport, and what do you think they should be?
So the physical plan of the airport itself?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's going to be...
Including access to it.
Well, fortunately for us, we passed Sound Transit 3, and over the next 30 years, we're going to, and that's a long time out, but for the next 30 years, we're going to have a comprehensive regional transportation system with direct connections to the airport. So that's going to get people to and from the airport. 65%, I believe, of the people that come to and from SeaTac Airport are actually coming to visit here or from here. They're not just passing through like Chicago or Detroit or Atlanta. So having a transit system that works is one half of that. The other side of it is that there's billions of dollars in infrastructure infrastructure investment that's going into the airport itself. And, you know, upgrading the facilities in terms of one, you know, making sure that there's the most logistically advanced technology, both in terms of like its functionality and also in terms of its carbon footprint. Because as you bring in more business, there's going to be more of a carbon intensive output, and so we have to make sure that there's checks on that as well. In terms of the freight aspect.
So we're over time, so
Okay,
we want
sorry.
to answer that. Sorry. So,
Didn't even get to freight, so we're still talking about people.
all right, so you mentioned that when you're not doing the work at the Port Commission, you'd still be doing your day job and doing, you know, what is
Right.
one aspect of what the port does. I'm wondering, would that set up any conflicts of interest, and would you have to recuse yourself from any of the votes on the port?
Currently, I'm a union officer. I'm vice president of Local 19, which is the Longshore local, and I'm also the president of our statewide political organization, our district council, and I would resign both of those posts. So literally, like, all I would do is drive a piece resign those posts.
So we are actually out of time. If you want to take 30 seconds for a closing statement.
All right, well, thanks for having me here. I could probably go on for another hour about the board, and I'm sure you guys want to get to the next candidate, but feel free to get in touch with me, feel free to call me, feel free to email me, set up coffee, be more than happy to talk more and dig deeper into some questions that I, didn't have enough time to get into, especially with the airport issue. More than happy to talk, so. I have some literature as well, has a website, you can contact me for one there as well, so. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.